So, this is Eva Ruth Moravec, and we're here a second time today, but this time with Amparo Garcia Crow. She's a local writer, a director, an actress, professor, and the founder and host of The Living Room, Storytime for Grown-Ups. And she's here with us today for a special bonus episode sponsored by Tecovas called Walk a Mile in Their Boots. It's Wednesday, June 18th. I'm Eva Ruth Moravec, and this is what Austin's talking about. So you founded The Living Room, Storytime for Grown-Ups, and you also host it. Can you tell me what The Living Room is and what inspired you to start it?
Yes. I've always been a storyteller with all the things that I like to create, whether I'm writing a song, whether I'm giving a lecture, whether I'm putting a workshop together, writing a play, a screenplay, a story, a memoir, whatever. That at the heart of it, it's making connection with a community of listeners. And the beauty of that has kept me in this particular gathering that we do every first Saturday since 2009. We took some time off for COVID. Scientifically, it's been proven that our brains become one when we're listening as an audience. And that's why I've always loved doing theater. There's just a live theater. There's an unmistakable communion that occurs. It's energetic. And even if you don't like everything you're hearing, it's still like a feeling of surrendering and becoming a child, curious again to hear somebody else's life story.
Wow, I love that. So what kinds of stories have you been finding that Austinites are interested in telling?
Well, the fun part for me as a host, and I work with the storytellers to organize the stories because, of course, everyone has had a big life. We're still even having a conversation about it. But to get it down to 12 minutes, because it's a night of 6 stories total, is the craft of it.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've noticed is that people, there's a theme, but the theme happens after the stories kind of congregate. It's almost like they have every month is its own little book of stories. The first Saturday in June, the theme was the faux pas story.
Oh.
Well, first of all, what does that mean? Yeah, where did you go when I said that, for example?
Embarrassment.
Exactly. So these are stories that everyone shares an embarrassment about or a regret or something that put them on the line of a social blunder, but that changed their life for the good, because ultimately in the hero's journey, things have to go very wrong before they can get right again. And then the storyteller brings the elixir of wisdom, as he called it, back to the community.
Wow. So these are all people's true stories, I take it, right?
Yes, they're all true. They're all true. That's the criteria. And as the organizer, and in some ways the director of it, meaning I try to have a beginning, a middle, and end for the night itself, what I'm listening for is stories that are about love, sex, death, health, and spiritual transformation. And that one, at least story, represents at the heart of it any of those possibilities.
That's awesome. And you've done so many other things, from teaching at the University of Texas and Austin Community College, and writing, directing, acting, being involved in theater and film. What would you say are some of the highlights of your career up to this point?
Well, the highlights are remembering what I fell in love with, which is the person who's willing to open their heart and truth to me. You know, like the play on words, the intimacy, is into me, see? Like, how can you not open your heart to someone who is trusting you with something that you can obviously tell was not easy to undergo? And at the same time, so the highlights have always been the gift I'm given to be their listener, if that makes any sense. And that was true as a professor, especially because I was always so inspired. And in some ways, my students were my teachers. I was learning from their individual calling and how they were approaching their lives as the inspiration, not just for the stories I wanted to tell, particularly as a writer, but that I could find myself over and over again in their story as well.
You sound like such a great teacher.
Oh, well, I just loved it so much, Thank you.
What's your favorite thing that you've produced as a creative?
My children. Because I happen to have two very creative children. And what I loved is that when I was a parent, I was very committed to being a learner, not just of social anthropology, but child development. And I admired the cultures, particularly indigenous cultures, the sense of community that it takes a village to raise a child,
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, I took that as a practice with my children. They were always with me. So they were watching the rehearsal about playing on the side, or they were part of it. If they had any curiosity, I wasn't going to put them in something they didn't want to be in. But in other words, like I heard my son one day doing an interview because he's a touring music artist. And I don't know if you know the artist Shakey Graves.
Yes. Very famous Austin musician.
Yeah, that's my son.
That's awesome.
I heard him say in an interview, he said, I just assumed as a young person that everybody lived this way. He just assumed that that's what people did. They created, they weren't making the song. They were, his father was also and is quite a creative because we met in the theater world. His father was a set and lighting designer. So he tended to create environments and I created the content, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
So watching my children become the adults that they've become is the purest art form that I'm in awe of.
Have you and Shakey Graves ever created a song together?
Oh, yes. We've done songs, characters, and for their birthdays, we always, we had huge, elaborate events. Like there was one year that we created where we would go and carol around the neighborhood. But it was this idea that we were supposed to invite the neighbors to be part of this performance that they didn't know they were doing. Not to make them embarrassed, but to suddenly realize that there's a lot of fun in playing.
Wow. That sounds fun. So I'm curious about, since you're such a storyteller and you've heard so many people's stories in Austin, what would you say is the story of Austin as you've seen it, this city change over the years that you've been here?
I came from a very tiny South Texas town that still has about 5,000 people. And it's literally in the middle of nowhere, South Texas. It's between Laredo and Corpus Christi.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I first came to UT in 1976 as a student, I was amazed that Jester Dormitory, I had almost as many people as my hometown. That was like such a culture shock.
Mm-hmm.
Because I thought they could all fit in this one dormitory. Everybody I grew up with and their parents and their grandparents. And Austin was still, for me, a large city, but it was a small, large city. And it was very quaint. And it was already very dynamic because it had I came in at the fringes of hippie land, and very quickly met some great collaborators that we created our own theater company. And we got so lucky because we created this one piece called In the West that we thought we would probably do like, oh, we do a short run of it. But in reality, it became a cult classic in Austin, and we ran it on and off for almost 8 years. And we even got invited to the Kennedy Center to do it.
Wow.
In Washington, D.C. And it was really storytelling. There were monologues created from real life stories that we turned into fiction. And we all put our names in the basket, and like we pulled out who we would write for and who would direct us. It was all random to start. But there was something so potent about what we captured about Austin in those years, because we were reflecting the diversity of Austin that was natural at the time. It was also the beginning of Keeping Austin Weird time. And in fact, one of my collaborators was the queen of weird, Erilyn Hughes. And we became collaborators for the next 30 years. Like when you talk about some of my favorite projects, it's the documentary film I made of her life called Love in the 60s. And, the Austin of those days, like when I remember they passed the legislation, and most people aren't aware of this because when they see people, particularly women, topless at Barton Springs, they assume it's just about Barton Springs, but no, it's actually legal in Austin for a woman to go topless. I don't know if you're aware about that.
No, this is going to change my whole experience.
Yeah, because you can just imagine when that came to fruition, you see women running, jogging without their shirts on, and it was perfectly okay, So that was a very different Austin, if you can imagine, right?
Mm-hmm. Do you think that Austin still exists today?
Yes, I do believe that. Even when the political scene goes from being conservative to liberal, the heart of Austin is still, I think, very much the place that I first fell in love with, in certain neighborhoods especially.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about what a regular day might look like for you here in Austin. There's probably not one format, but can you take us through walking a mile in your boots and what your normal day looks like?
The creative affirmation I make for myself is, let me be at the right place at the right time, saying the right thing for the right purpose and benefit of all. So in other words, it can be literally at the grocery store where I happen to reach for something and somebody else is reaching at the same time. And we say hello, and then begins a conversation. So with that kind of openness, or the golden rule of improvisation that I used to teach when I was training young actors, is you say yes and to everything that unfolds. And so that's been a lifetime purpose for me. Like every day is saying yes to what I can hope happens, but ultimately going with the flow. Like today is a good example. Like I knew we had this conversation planned for a certain time, but it just so happened that one of my dear friends ended up at the emergency room last night. And she lives in Wimberley, and she had been brought in by another friend and needed to get back to some appointments this morning to double check. So suddenly everything else took a second, not just because a dear friend is in need, but that's a very typical day. There's the creative things that I do. In the morning, I like to write, and I'm working on a book right now, project with the Queen of Weird again, Erilyn Hughes, and my daughter. Erilyn is just turned 79. My daughter's 26. And it's a conversation they're having together as this memoir. And I'm kind of the host in between as an observer and as a witness, right?
Wow.
And it's as our lives unfold, because my daughter's beginning her life, and Erilyn is very aware that hers is coming to the last chapters of her life, if not last chapter. So it becomes a very provocative conversation between the many generations of being in Austin, because Erilyn came here in the 60s and my daughter was born here in the 90s.
Wow, that sounds like a really good read. Looking forward to it. I'm curious about what your take is on Austin's art and culture scene. Would you say that, this is still a good city for actors and playwrights and other creatives like yourself?
Absolutely. Now, what may be challenging is the cost.
Mm-hmm.
And because right now so many of the grants and things are being threatened politically. But even without that as a unique and special challenge, for all artists, even in my generation, it's finding the space to rehearse, the space to create. That's always been a special challenge. Like in my generation, we would go to what is now the groovy part of 6th Street, but in those years, it was considered kind of the cheap rat infested warehouses, where we would go and rehearse because it was cheap to rehearse there. So the challenges haven't changed for an artist in the sense, like I used to tell my students, we don't aim for fame because that's not the true heart of an artist. An artist loves to create just to create. And those kinds of things that happen for the people that get successful, quote unquote, whatever that means, or make money at it, requires a sense of luck sometimes that not everybody gets.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean that they're not great artists, because this is full of them. And I know that I still get to enjoy many of them at some of the fringe theaters, like Hyde Park. I do remember when that first became a venue, if you can believe that, and did some early one-woman shows there of my own. But I love that impulse to always tell a story and to be true to our creative muse is never going to go away.
Mm-hmm.
Because whatever you love, you must learn to trust to give yourself 100% to it, regardless of what it's going to take to get there.
Mm-hmm. Now I have to ask, because your son, known as Shakey Graves to all of us, has reached this kind of fame, for sure for Austinites and people, music lovers around the country. What is something that Austinites should know about Shakey Graves that we don't know?
I love that he still trusts the unknown. And that takes a lot of love for what you like to create more than whether it's going to be successful or not, because it takes a lot of courage to trust the impulse and to let yourself, I see him still having lots of fun with not knowing where it's going to land.
That's awesome. Well, this has been delightful. Amparo, is there anything else that you want to add about Austin, being a creative here?
Well, I'm just grateful that I found the place that feels like home, that regardless of how radical, even political things can become, because it's been like that. Now that I'm 67 and I got here at 18, I've seen many ups and downs and change of directions. But what stayed true was always the artist. As long as they were taking the opportunity to get to know themselves first through the work that wants to come through them, then we're all going to be okay, so long as that impulse is honored and trusted.
Amparo Garcia Crow, thank you so much for joining us on this special episode of CityCast Austin, sponsored by Tecovas. We will have a link to the Tecovas Austin stores in our show notes. Bye, y'all.